Black is beautiful. Yes, it is. Black is beautiful. Black is beautiful.
No justice, no peace. I'm Janelle.
I'm Kalia.
I'm Alana.
And I'm Donnie.
And welcome to DMLK's The Take. This series will address the inequities students face in education today. We will discuss how to keep our resolution alive by having conversations with key people involved in the implementation, sustainability, and overall success of our resolution. In last week's episode, we spoke to a few key stakeholders in the equity department who are in collaboration with us to ensure the prosperity of the No Justice, No Peace resolution.
Speaking to the equity department last episode bridged a gap for me and personally made me feel a lot more secure in our connections with them, being important figures in the equity work within DPS we're contributing to.
What stood out to me when talking to the equity department was having them agree to professional development that will be mandatory and required to prepare teachers and leaders to understand and evaluate the history and culture of systemically marginalized communities.
Talking to them really gave me a new perspective on equity within DPS, the department's next steps, and how we can further our resolution's success.
So I'm sure y'all are wondering what's up this week. This is Push Pull Win. Yep. The phrase push pull win is a reference to the journey we've taken alongside the Board of Education, our amazing and relentless collaboration, efforts, and meetings with the board, along with their thoughts, views, and actions directed towards our resolution and the progression of equity work in DPS.
In today's episode, we'll be speaking to members of the board, Jennifer Bacon, Tate Anderson, Scott Baldermann, Reverend Brad Laurvick, and Dr. Carrie Olson.
Welcome and thank you for joining us on The Take. We are so grateful to have you on the show today. Before we get started, we have to remind our listeners about our trigger alert. Alana, can you please read the trigger alert?
If you are not 110% in support of Black Lives Matter, please dismiss yourself. If you are in any sort of agreement with the systemic oppressions this country has inflicted on minorities, once again, please dismiss yourself. And if you are not willing to give every bit the power that the people so undeniably deserve, then please dismiss yourself. Because in a few moments, you will witness vast amounts of Black engagement. And if you do not dismiss yourself, then the thoughts, facts, and feelings we're about to share today will most definitely dismiss you.
Okay, so let's dive right into the discussion. Let's start by having each of you tell the listeners a few things you would like them to know and what influenced you to run for the board seat.
My name is Director Tate Anderson. What inspired me to run for the Denver School Board was the lack of representation, especially of African Americans on the Denver School Board that actually could relate to the stories of our students. And when I was in high school, there was a decision that was made for my high school at Manual High School without student input. And I had asked Happy Haynes at the time, how do we get our voices on the Denver School Board? And she sarcastically responded, you need to run and win like the rest of us. So 4 years later, I replaced her on the Denver School Board after she was turned out.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, ladies. It's an honor to be here. Thank you so much for having me. I'm not sure if you can see my virtual background. This image is the exit hallway from the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, where Dr. King was assassinated. You leave this hallway and enter into the hotel room in which he stayed. And at the top of it, it says, what do we want? And the answer is to determine the destiny of our community. And I ran because I too, once upon a time, was a Black girl in public education, may not have been in DPS such as Director Anderson, but there are a lot of experiences that translate and that are the same. And through my experience, I grew up to be in a place in which I wanted to be a partner for my community to help accomplish this goal, to be able to self-determine. And self-determination looks like, how do we learn about who we are more so that we don't just master reading, writing, and math and science, but we know who we are and our place in this world as leaders. And so I felt similarly situated in that when I was a kid, despite going to a Black high school, I didn't see many Black teachers. I had to learn my own history. And so I came to join the classroom right out of college. And that's all to say that it matters who's in front of kids, and it matters what we learn to build the strength of our communities. And so I thought education was a vehicle for that. And so there is so much more that I wanted to do that I wasn't able to do while being an administrator or a teacher or even an attorney. And I thought that perhaps if I get on school board, I can help change our fate. And so I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be able to serve. And I'm also grateful that my community members chose me, that, I didn't just place myself. I had to ask for support and permission from my neighbors. And I was really blessed to be able to seek that opportunity and have the opportunity to sit here with you all.
So my name is Scott Baldermann, and I'm the director for District 1 on the school board, which is Southeast Denver, and been on the board for a little over a year with Director Anderson and Reverend Laurvick. And why I ran, I have 2 kids in the elementary school right now, and I've been very involved with my kids' school from day one. Really, what got me interested in running for school board goes back to 2017 when I started going to teacher strike meetings. It's something that just interested me, and over the next year, that evolved, and I eventually started having teachers approach me and ask me to run for school board. And so I did a lot of researching over the months, a lot of meetings, and my interest grew, and to the point where I decided to run. So what to know about me? I'm a big believer that we should be a collaborative school district and not a competitive district of schools. So I'm a collectivist at heart. I think we should lift all schools to make all schools a great opportunity for all kids. And so at the end of the day, I don't think I don't think competition is the way that we make great schools, but through collaboration. And before we get too far, I also want to thank all of you for having the school board on here. A lot of times the school board members, it's easy for us to fall into our comfort zones where we get into the day-to-day management of the school district, and we don't really step back and look at the big picture. And what we're doing today is great. This is a great exercise for school board. We need to remind ourselves, we need to have more conversations like this with students like you and with community. So again, thank you for that reminder.
I think it looks like we're going through our usual order we talk on the board, so I'll hop in. My name is Brad Laurvick, and I serve on the Denver Public School Board representing the north and west side of town. District 5 is what it's called. I also serve that same community as a pastor in the United Methodist Church. So that's my day job, right? So I spend my time building a home where all belong, serving a community of progressive values, looking to try to actually do something about it besides talk. And so that's one of the ways that I began to engage the community in deeper ways. Like we started hosting some of those strike meetings back in the day. Those are places where we wanted community to be together and to talk. And so as far as getting involved with the board, some of it came from those conversations with teachers directly. Some of it came from some elected officials and former elected officials, including a former school board member from my neighborhood who outright said, hey, we see you involved with the teachers. We know you're connected to the schools and the community. We need someone who represents those values to run because we need that. And so that was part of that invitation as well that got me to this place. As Scott mentioned, Director Anderson and Director Baldermann and I have been on just over a year, and it's been a very interesting year. I know some of the questions coming up will be like, what have you done? And it's so interesting because there's things we did that are passion projects for so many of us. It's also, this year has been a very interesting year when it comes to how do we make sure to tend to these key values in the midst of feeling like we're on our heels the whole time. It feels like we're constantly reacting to things. And how do we make sure we do that from our values, even when we want to be as proactive as possible? So that I think will be an interesting part of the conversation today. We are certainly in a unique moment. And I'm very grateful to get to be in conversation with you.
Thank you. I'd just like to echo everybody's thanks for having us here. I've been looking forward to this. And part of it stems from my past as a teacher. I taught in Denver Public Schools for 33 years. It's always inspiring to hear from students, and to Director Baldermann's point, this is important to us to understand how our policies play out in your minds and what we could be doing better. Right behind me, you'll see the Miss Olson sign, and that Miss Olson sign actually sat sat in my classroom for 25 years, and a friend of mine took it and framed it for me when I left. I know I've spoken with all four of you, my passion for educational travel, as I traveled with over 800 students from the West Side to Washington, D.C. and Europe. So I know the power of education through travel and experiential learning and how it can change things. Although I think you guys have taken it farther than I've ever seen. So congratulations. I'm also a mother. My daughter went through Denver Public Schools and is a proud George Washington High School graduate. In fact, she's working for GW this weekend on their speech and debate tournament. You can, even though you leave, you always want to come back and help your alma mater. I'm also an adjunct professor at the University of Denver for pre-service teachers, and one of my teachers is actually at DMLK this year. So I've gotten to get into some of your classrooms and see how your teachers and how your students are adjusting to online learning. And how I got here today was a friend of mine came to me when I was a teacher. I had no desire to run for the school board, and she asked me to talk to her out of respect for all the work we did together when we were getting our PhDs at DU. And she said, just listen to me. And I had also been at Kepner when Kepner was redesigned and closed and made into 4 schools from 1. And that was a heartbreaking experience. So I learned the power that a school board has over the day-to-day lives of students and teachers. And so after talking to her, and she said there's never been a career educator from Denver Public Schools who served on the board, I decided to run. And I think much to everybody's surprise, including my own, I won. And I was proud to be able to campaign a lot with Jennifer Bacon, and Tay Anderson taught me how to do my first live Facebook Live video. Now I'm really dating myself. So it's been a pleasure to serve over this past year. And thank you again for having us here.
It is definitely our pleasure, and thank you again, all of you, for sharing that information. It definitely means a lot to us.
We know that some of our achievements, big and small, go unnoticed. I'm curious if you can highlight or list some of the achievements you have made since you first joined the board.
You know, this last year we've been hard at work around student-centered ideas. That's what I ran on, was going to students and asking them, what are things that you want to see change? And so this past year of being on the school board, we came out of the gate with LGBTQIA plus inclusion resolution, mandating all schools have an all gender restroom that is accessible to all students. I co-sponsored a resolution with Reverend Laurvick on safe gun storage, as gun violence is a very important issue for both of us, ensuring that our students, especially with the summer and winter that we had the prior year before, with gang violence, we wanted to be able to at least educate our families on how to keep their firearms safe in their homes. We did a co-sponsored resolution with Vice President Jennifer Bacon on removing school resource officers and implementing more mental health resources. And then I will say most recently partnering with you all to make sure that we got the No Justice, No Peace resolution introduced. That wasn't the finish line. That was just the start of the race. And now we are working to make sure that that work is followed through and ensuring that all of our students know that we have champions and that this board believes in fighting for student voices and fighting for student empowerment. And I'm proud to say all but one resolution has been that I've brought forward have all been unanimous. And this board is really valuing our students and putting you first.
Thank you for the question. I think Dr. Olson and I have, obviously we have a little bit of a different path with having served on the board for 3 years now. And the environment was different a couple of years ago, not just the pandemic. But I think one of the biggest pieces of an accomplishment on our behalf is actually shifting culture. There's a lot that we do behind the scenes. And, perhaps we haven't brought every resolution, but there are some big things that I've been able to fight for with the support of my colleagues to do as much as we can, again, to shift culture. So, we'll probably talk a little bit about this more, given you have a lot of questions on the far Northeast. I represent District 4, and District 4 is Northeast Denver from 5 Points to the airport. I live in Montbello. DMLK is 6 minutes from my house. And so when I see you all in the neighborhood, I know where some of y'all work because I go through certain drive-through, you know what I'm talking about. And so this community is incredibly important to me. So one other thing that's true is that I live next to the Rachel B. Knoll building. And that means for the last 10 years, I've seen our schools change. I've seen our neighborhood grow. I've seen schools come and go, including Montbello High School. And when I ran, I really wanted to address the nature of how decisions were made for our district, and particularly Northeast Denver, which was from a very top-down way. And so you may hear this term around DPS that says community-driven, district-supported. And that was something that I really fought for, to be able to say in this vein of self-determination that our communities know what we want and need if our baseline truly is inclusion, equality, and equity. Those are different things that our neighbors, including our students, should have a say in how their school communities are built and how they function. And so there are a lot of things that we have changed by way of school performance, by way of assessment and inclusion of school leader voice and teacher voice, particularly Black teachers and also brown teachers. Big resolutions that you've seen from me, yes, the SRO piece, and that really comes from addressing 3 layers down, what is it that we are conditioning our kids to accept? And you can just think about Angela Davis's quote, right? How do we talk about culture from at the root? And freedom really starts from, do our students know their history, themselves, and their origins, and what they do and do not have to tolerate? And the issue around the SRO piece was our students being conditioned to be policed in schools, to see police officers when their behavior changed, and that only certain students began to really be introduced to that relationship at a certain age that would be so critical for the rest of their lives, particularly if you're an African American in this country. And so we'll talk a little bit later. I was a teacher that was in an administrator that was interviewed for Sharon Bailey's report. And out of that, part of the reason why I ran too is that I didn't think it was coming too much into fruition. So I worked to get the Black Excellence Resolution passed. And quite honestly, the Black Excellence Resolution that we are all, operating under now is supposed to be part 1, where we wanted to prioritize taking on student health and concerns, which also talked about culturally responsive education and curriculum and the work that you do. I'm not taking responsibility for the work that you're doing, but I really hope to be a steward to open that door and to have that conversation not just brought up by students, but readily received because of my presence and the hammering down of why this is important. We have subcommittees on our board, and Director Anderson and I sit on the equity subcommittee, where we have taken on issues for staff with looking at pay equity. We've also been working on an ombudsperson office, which is a space where people get to air out their grievances if they're having challenges with their managers who may not be culturally responsive themselves. And so there are a whole bunch of institutional things that I think you can read into that resolution. For example, a big part was saying that the community gets to name, particularly the African-American community gets to name what Black excellence is. And our assessment of doing that work with schools and community. So there's some things that we still have to work on, but those are some of my biggest accomplishments. And the last thing I'll say too is that on behalf of the far Northeast, it's really being an advocate and hitting hard on saying the things that we are doing are not working. Our school leaders and our teachers of color are struggling. We do not have the robust options, and DMOK is like the jewel of DPS. But you all know the conversations around Montbello. And so it is a win to say that we are reunifying the school, particularly if it comes from community voice and also being able to provide deeper opportunities to the far Northeast that we haven't been able to do before. And so again, this all goes into how do we build a vision together as Northeast Denver about our school opportunities, how we work together so that every child who lives out here finds their best fit and has a great opportunity to succeed, post high school.
So I thought of two accomplishments for the board that haven't been highlighted yet. One of them was our district budget. When COVID hit earlier, or almost a year ago now, the state came to us and said we were going to be losing $65 million of our budget. And that was a big shock to our system. And, I was able to partner with Treasurer Cobian and Director Bacon, and we had a budget advisory committee that was meeting. I mean, we went from like thinking we were going to have a surplus to like in a matter of weeks that we were going to be cutting $65 million from our budget. It was intense, and we worked on that for at least 2 months. We were meeting regularly, and I think what we really accomplished as a group, not only the board, but this budget advisory committee, is we were able to have no impact on school budgets. We set that as a priority and a value that we wanted to make sure that students and the school buildings did not feel the impacts when it came to their education during COVID-19. We also were real focused on, our teachers who've been underpaid for a long time, that we were able to keep them on track with their steps and lanes. Sorry, phone's ringing here. Steps and lanes, and still be able to give some of our workers that are on the lower end of our wage scale a cost of living increase. So that was key, because I mean, Denver is a critical component of the economy. We're the second largest employer in the city, and we have an impact on the local economy. We wanted to make sure that we helped families to be able to weather the storm here. The other big thing is the Denver School Leader Association. So the DPS, we voted a few months ago to have the first principals or the school leader union in the state. And I think that's going to be big. That's going to be transformational for DPS. And I was just looking at their application for their school leaders, and they focus on collective voice and fair treatment, and leading with an anti-racist policy and practice. And now that our school leaders have a collective voice that they can get around, I think it's going to be great. It's going to be great for our district. And we were talking about this could impact the district for 100 years. So we're all real excited about those two things in particular.
Director Anderson gave you a pretty good rundown of the resolutions. So a couple of things that don't show up in resolutions, but have been done in that sort of smaller, they don't come up with a big banner above them. One of them would be COVID response. Dr. Olson and I have been a part of meetings when things first shut down back in March. Our meetings were about 2 hours a day, and they were 5, sometimes 6 days a week. So we were talking, 10, 12 hours a week, just engaging in conversation with leadership and school leaders and teachers and staff to make sure we could take care of everybody as best as possible. And so that was, I think, a really amazing thing to be a part of, is responding to crisis. And then another one that's really important to me is, and now it's very different at the moment because we're not in building the same way or haven't been, but right before we were hitting the shutdown, I've been working with the safety department to change how we do lockdown drills. So when we do a drill, particularly for our elementary and middle, and we were about to then roll things out to high school level, but that when the tones go off to say, hey, everyone, locks, lights, out of sight, it would then notify folks this is a drill. So that during that time period of that drill, no one is sitting there wondering, do I need to text my mom? Everyone knows this is us practicing. And I think that would shift the experience of our students. So that's something that we've been working on that I'm very grateful to know will be different when we go back in person.
I think my colleagues have given you a pretty good rundown of all the things that we've worked on the board. I'd just like to highlight also the reimagining of the SPF on how we look at school quality and what's important, that it's not just based on test scores, but it's also looking at the social emotional needs of students in the building. And so you'll see more about that as we come down. And as Brad Laurvick mentioned, the crisis priorities. I was watching what I thought was going to be a boring webinar one day, and I saw how Houston was directing their superintendent to just focus on 3 things. So in consult with, first of all, with Vice President Bacon, and then with our superintendent, we changed where we were going in the district from the Denver plan to focusing on meeting the health and safety, social emotional needs, and learning needs of our students and families during this time, and teachers and staff, of course. And I think another thing we've all done as a board is we've highlighted students' voices, not just through you, but Director Anderson and I are liaisons to the student voice and leadership, and we meet monthly with them, which hadn't been happening before, and we are constantly finding ways to bring their voices forward. And one thing that I've brought is just a deeper understanding of culturally responsive education. I know you mentioned this in your last podcast when you asked Susana Cordoba that the majority of our teachers are white and the majority of our students are non-white. And so how do we as a district push that forward? And I'm really interested in that. I talk with with Tamara a lot, and I know you know her. And I'm also going to be taking part in the 6-month cohort of Zaretta Hammonds, where we dig into that and how does that play out in schools? Because if we're not building capacity with teachers and leaders in our buildings, all of these resolutions are great, but to your point from your last podcast, if teachers don't know how to work with this, it's not going to go anywhere. So thank you so much for that and for sending me the links ahead of time so I could be prepared. And I know we're way over our time, so I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for that. Honestly, I would try to recap that, but I feel like I couldn't even do it justice. So just from what I've heard so far, it must have taken clearly it took a lot of time and work to build your foundations of achievements as individual board members. So with all of this work, what would you say are the board's main roles and responsibilities?
So the role of the board is oversight of the superintendent. We always say the board really only has one employee, and that's the superintendent. But having said that, I think you'll notice that this board is different perhaps than other school boards in the past, or even other school boards that you might see around the country, is that we're really curious how some of the things that we implement and we bring forward play out in our schools. So we're in schools a lot, especially before the pandemic. All of us who are here on this calls we were always in schools. I knew that everybody was not only visiting their own schools, but visiting other schools. I've been out to the far Northeast many times, thanks to Vice President Bacon, who invited me out there, because in order for us to understand our role in supervising the superintendent, we have to understand how that's playing out in schools. So the role of the board is to set the mission and the values and the direction for the district, and then tell the superintendent, this is what we want you to do. And Vice President Bacon, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I would just add that vision piece and direction, but the third technical piece of what we also do is actually approve our budget. And that's a big deal as well, as our budget is supposed to mirror our values.
So as you know, we've been working very close with equity, and each of us have our own personal visions of equity. So we're curious, what are your personal visions for equity in our district?
For me, my vision of equity is making sure that all students have the same resources, or figuring out where more resources are needed, regardless of their zip code, what their school, the makeup of their school is, or if they are free reduced lunch or not. And so really making sure that we have, we're not walking into scenarios where schools are saying, well, this school can have X, Y, and Z because of this factor, and this school is not able to have this, where we're fighting to make sure that everybody has an equitable playing field, but we're also looking at the schools that need it the most and supporting them first, and really figuring out how we can pump those resources to them faster.
Yeah, I would quickly add that I look at equity as a means to accomplish equality, right? And equality that we are seeking is that everyone is free, and in some ways have really accomplished liberation. And so just for context, everyone's seen the meme, right, of the kids on the boxes and the fence, right? And the difference between equality and equity. And equity is those boxes, but actual liberation and freedom is there not being a fence at all, right? And so if we're still living in the place where we want kids to see over the fence, equity means meeting kids where they're at, or meeting whomever where they're at, and also in the terms of what they say they need, not what other people say they need, to be able to accomplish their version of freedom. And so I think for this, it means that if we say, again, kids master all these subjects, but they also know who they are in this world as a leader, that means what we have to do is meet our students at where they're at, and enter a dialogue to understand what that means for them, with the collective wisdom of elders, as well as the insight of our students, to be able to achieve that outcome for them.
So I'm going to echo a lot what Director Anderson's talking about is resource equity. That resources always come to mind for me when it comes to equity. And for the last 15 or so years, the district's been very focused on closing the achievement gap. Yet we still see similar achievement gaps after all this energy has been put into a lot of these policies that are still in place today. About a year ago, when we went to our first board retreat, I have this slide. It's really hard to see, but this is a slide that was distributed to the board, and it this kind of like is what I talk about resource equity. And I'll try to read some of the highlights of this slide that I reference a lot. Is in the title of it says, as enrollment declines, schools cannot offer the same level of programming. And so some of the bullet points say schools with fewer than 300 students typically do not have assistant principals, robust specials, full-time mental health, speech and counseling, or nurses. And for our elementary schools that have fewer than 300 students, half are likely to be high performing, so like a green or a blue school. 80% of elementary schools with an average class size of greater than 33 are schools that are experiencing significant enrollment declines. And then you think of all of these things, and this next bullet says 94% of students in DPS's most under-enrolled schools are students of color. And it says that FRL students are approximately 3 times more likely to be attending an under-enrolled school compared to non-FRL students. So to me, that's a problem with equity right there. And so we really need to be focusing on, what our students' needs. That's my definition of equity. What do we need? And there's some students that need more than others, and we need to focus on that. And really, to me, it comes back to this competitive culture that has been in DPS for a long time. And what that creates is haves and have-nots. And we've got the data within the district to really show that. So we really need to take a close look at some of our policies as a board of, what is that competition and what has that done to some of our students.
So with that being said, I would like to ask you guys, during these times of such open hatred, ignorance, and racism, in order to seek the change that is needed to disrupt this cycle of injustice against people of color, would you guys agree that school boards must have a strong commitment to racial equity?
I mean, the short and simple answer to your question is yes. It is very important that school boards have a strong commitment to racial equity. There should be no pause. There should be no hesitation and no equivocation on answering that question. I think the follow-up, though, is how do we do that? And how do we turn, of course, everyone's going to say yes to that question. How do we turn that into real accomplishment? And I think that for me, that's really right now about our commitment as a board to making sure that every student, every staff member has both the learning environments, the experiences, and the expectations that are rooted in the dignity of every single person, right? That we look at and honor the dignity every single person carries, and that has to drive us. That's really key to me as we do so as a board.
I would just echo exactly what Reverend Laurvick said. Yes, and if we don't make certain other commitments to ourselves and to our roles, it's not going to go anywhere. Going back to my point before, the board is all engaging in the equity experience, which has been developed by our fabulous Leslie Junell and her team, where we examine our privilege, especially as the white board members on this board. We really need to become co-conspirators and look at anti-racist education and understand what that means, because it's one thing to say it in the words and have a commitment without a pause, but it's another to examine our own privilege and really be thinking about how do we get ready to look for injustice as they show up through Denver Public Schools. And like Susanna said in her podcast with you, like looking at things through fresh eyes. I know she mentioned you think that you're always on the right path and someone else comes in and looks at it and says, maybe not. We have to be willing to examine ourselves so that we can raise critical consciousness and always be looking at culturally responsive education. And are we really looking at creating independent learners, just like what you guys have done, questioning the narratives, the dominant narratives about people of color and how they show up in our schools and in our curriculum?
I completely agree. I feel like just the fact that you're pointing that out specifically with you, Reverend Laurvick, how like it's kind of what questions or just scenarios where the answer is just so clear. It's one thing to say, yes, I do believe in that, but it's another thing to actually make the commitment to bring it to life. So I appreciate you acknowledging that. And considering the racial inequities within DPS, I remember Sharon Bailey examined student and educator experiences in Denver Public Schools through the voices of African-American teachers and administrators. After reviewing this report, what were your major takeaways regarding the treatment of Black leaders in DPS?
So I think what was really important about the Bailey report was that it kind of put to paper the things that a lot of people have been saying for a long time, which was also in itself problematic because it meant our narratives weren't really believed. I think that what the Bailey report really spurned was that DPS does a great job at talking a good game, but we don't hold ourselves accountable to seeing it through. And so for me, what that meant was we needed some action items that came with real deadlines and benchmarks and all of those types of words to be sure that the direction of this ship that we're steering was moving in the right way. I mean, what you heard people talk about were all the things that Black and Brown people experience, almost so that we have our own language. Like, we talk about the tax, right? And that means, what is the extra work that we have to do as people of color? You're going to find a lot of African Americans in dean roles and administrative roles working with kids. For example, like the term on the street is hallway sweepers. Like, when the kids who are challenges, guess who gets them, right? And I think you all can see that too. And so how do you call out behaviors like that that are said and unsaid? And so part of the Black Excellence Resolution was to actually name, like that first part with dealing with students, was to actually name, despite us saying diversity, inclusion, equity, all of those things, African-American students still have a 2 out of 10 chance of being on grade level after 10 years. And no one was willing to say that out loud, right? And so we had to say, this is what we want to see and when. But that also meant that we had to examine our own practices to hold us accountable as well. We had to do little things like disaggregate data, you know, so they're like 50% of teachers are people of color. How many are Black, right? So those are the types of things that we had to dig through to be able to actually identify our institutional culture and say, we are institutionally racist. And at one point after the Bailey report, Tom Boasberg actually said that, but he needed to be pushed to follow up on that too, right? And so it's to believe us in our stories and experiences, get behind people, and then hold our actual institution and practices accountable. And so we said, how many people have actually trained on implicit bias? So we mandated it, right? How many people have actually questioned the curriculum that they're teaching? So we took a look at it. But, you know, before that, we had, what did Dr. Jefferson say? Like 17 resolutions that talked about equity and inclusion, but very few put a finger on something and named some action steps.
And I'll add on to say that one of the biggest takeaways that I've, you know, since the Bailey report was commissioned and speaking with, you know, Black leaders and teachers is that we as a district have chronically underpaid individuals and I wouldn't say it was solely on the basis of one's skin color, but I will say that we have noticed in our district that we have seen white male leaders earn more who have been, you know, a principal less than a Black woman who has been leading in the far Northeast for almost a decade. So we've seen those discrepancies and we're working. And that's, I think, one of the great reasons why the DSLA is formed, is to address those things. I believe our principals got a pay increase this semester because of the work of acknowledging when DSLA, the Denver School Leaders Association, formed. They acknowledged that there were members of their union that were chronically underpaid in their profession, and that was one of the issues of equity they wanted to tackle. And they were able to get a first start. I believe that our school leaders got at least, I believe it was like a $3,000 pay increase at the beginning of this year, something that, you know, a lot of school leaders haven't had in quite some time. And then also for our educators, when it came down to the strike, that was something that was brought up as well, is like, how are we able to recruit and retain Black and brown educators in the Denver public schools? And one of the chronic issues is that when you're looking at the cost of living in Denver, especially if we're trying to recruit from other places, you also have to acknowledge that Denver is, and I say it all the time, it's Wakanda for white folks. And so it's not that much appealing to Black folks to come on out to Denver, Colorado to be a teacher, because they're looking at the cost of living in other places where it's predominantly Black, where they have had a long history of African-American excellence and history, and they're getting paid more and they're getting treated better. And then they look at Denver and they're like, oh, I'm reading this and you had to get it shouldn't have taken us to do a Bailey report to say that Denver Public Schools is a racist institution and has embodied racism in our history. However, that's now what we're taking away from it is, I would say, like I said, is just really practicing and looking at how we're paying those educators, and really giving them reasons to come back to the Denver Public Schools. And I think we're doing a lot of that great work now, out of the Bailey Report, out of the Black Excellence Resolution, but really and now out of the other things that have formed out, like DSLA and DCTA and the Black Caucus, et cetera. So we're starting to see more work being done because there's an issue, there's a lens on that piece of, especially that pay and equity in DPS.
You're looking at how you're paying and treating your educators, which bridges me right into my next question. What are you most proud of that DPS changed after the investigation was completed, and what do you think still needs to be targeted? And how do you plan to target these areas that still need growth?
Yeah, I think that we still need to do some work around not so much recruitment, I would also say retention and inclusion of our staff, including teachers and front office workers, and school leaders of color, and particularly African Americans. One of the things that I say often too is that Black people in their activism play a very particular role in civic change in this country. There are a lot of things that African American presence really serves as a litmus test for, including what we will and will not tolerate as a country and how we treat people. And even though we are not as big of a minority group, a lot of things start and stop with African Americans that permeates into culture, including everything from like pay and being able to have voice. So we need to actually work on and understand our systems to include people better. Equity is actually hard work, and it's much more than just knowing what the definition or the meme is. I mentioned before, it means understanding people's experiences to meet them where they're at, to get them what they need. And so we have to do more than the check boxes by having bodies in the space. We have to actually hear their voices and implement what it is people say that they need. And I also think that comes with us all, at least starting with having an understanding of what inclusion means, what anti-racism is, what bias is, so that we can actually have a fair shot in doing that. So I think there's a lot more work we need to do there. I also think that some work that we need to do, going back to something Director Baldermann said, is when you live in a place in which you're competing, you miss out on the biggest assets around you, which is your team and other people. And so how do we shift our culture to be more cooperative so that we can tap into all of our talents to get us all collectively where we need to go? I think particularly in the far Northeast, a family that might have 4 kids, send their kids to 4 different schools, but that's one family. And it doesn't mean that people don't need to know what's going on in each other's buildings so that we can all move forward together. And so if we can do some of those things, I think it'll set us up to be a little bit more successful in not only our equity work, but our anti-racism work.
I think what I'm most proud of is that this conversation is highlighted all the time in Denver Public Schools, and that my entire board colleagues, we're all committed to this, and we push each other and we question each other. And just the fact that in a professional development, we can be talking about decolonizing education and how does that show up, and teachers are okay to talk about that. I think last year, not this past year, but in 2019, I went with our then Superintendent Cordova with a student I was mentoring, and we went to the new teacher education, and I was sitting in the back, and most people don't know who I am, which is great. I like to be a little behind the scenes. And there were a group of teachers who had just been hired by Denver Public Schools sitting there taking pictures of Susanna's slides, where her mission was to create equity, not by accident, but by design, and working on historically underserved students in our school district and to decolonize education. And they were whispering back and forth saying, can you believe the superintendent is saying this? I'm so glad I'm here. This is it. So again, I'm glad that we're able to say these things out loud and we can work on this. And I think where our challenges comes back to what I've mentioned before, working in the classroom and working with our teachers. I think of what you'll hear me talk about Zaretta Hammond a lot. I'm just so impressed with how she's been able to take all of the theory and the big ideas and put them into play in the classroom. She keeps reminding us that a lot of students have gotten a double dose of multicultural education and like taco night, but they haven't got enough independent learning skills. and their capacity to be independent learners and thinkers, to think about how to push back on some of the dominant narratives that are told in their classrooms. They haven't gotten that, and teachers haven't gotten that. I think of a conversation I had with a pre-service teacher who said, my students don't know manners. And I said, well, define what manners are. And she's like, well, this, and she told me how it showed up, and it came from a very white middle-class background. And just watching her go through that journey of examining that, and she's now on the equity committee at her school and really pushing herself. That's where our work is. How do we continue to push back on the narratives and help our teachers become more culturally responsive educators? I think the will is there. I haven't heard any teacher say, I don't want to do that work. They just don't know how to. So continuing, and I shouldn't say they don't know how, they know how, but it's a journey, right? Like it's not going to happen overnight. So how can we continue to support our leaders and our teachers in our buildings to do the work that they know is right for their students?
And I think what I'm most proud of is a board when it comes to the Bailey investigation comes back to the Denver School Leader Association, their formation, as well as the SR or the School Resource Officer resolution that Director Bacon and Director Anderson sponsored. But going back to DSLA, Director Anderson was talking about the fair compensation system. I think this is going to be, if we have a structure in place, it's going to be critical in the recruitment and retention of our leaders of color. And then something else that worth noting is just the supervisory treatment of certain school leaders. It's different across different regions of the city, and we need to honor the different factors that go into the different areas of the city. There's different needs involved, and we need to honor that. When it comes to our school leaders, and really look closely at what is a district's definition of success when we have these different needs across the city. Now, one of the other within the Bailey report, there's the issue of discipline policies and the disparities of our students of color when it comes to arrests and expulsion. And I'm really hopeful that as we dig in further with this SRO resolution, that we're going to be able to take a closer look at those particular issues within our discipline policies.
I don't really know what to add on to that. I've never really thought of it like that before. And I just want to switch gears a little bit by just acknowledging that over the past 3 years, the far northeast region has dealt with a lot of unrest, resulting in building leaders feeling burnt out and seeking an exit from DPS. And I know that my school leader is juggling hybrid learning, empowering us as equity student leaders, and pushing for change throughout the district by serving on several committees to ensure that the far northeast is heard as a district making decisions. This workload is a lot, and as well as ensuring that we are a staff as one, not as a staff of many, grounded in anti-racist practices, it can be very overwhelming and unsustainable. The expectations of our leaders in the far northeast are not the same as other leaders in other regions. Our principal works extremely hard to truly be a transformational leader, and now in the midst of this pandemic, which has hit the far northeast region much harder than any other areas, they're focusing not only on academics, but the social, emotional health, mental health, and physical safety of their students as well. But they can't really physically be with them day to day. So my question is, what is the DPS Board of Education doing to support leaders in the far northeast at this time?
I want to start as the representative of the far northeast, and I won't necessarily speak for my colleagues, but your school leader and I talk often. And some of the things that we experience in the far northeast by way of differences are we think about what this like success express and what that means, right? Families. We kind of serve a community more so than maybe other neighborhoods, even though we have a choice system. Some other neighborhoods have a little bit more of a neighborhood focus when it comes to schools. We've seen a rash of youth violence. We also have actually, the far northeast is the most actually diverse neighborhood in all of Denver. And we haven't had a chance to really tap into our creativities and assets and our diversity. And then we have quite honestly become a lab or a microcosm for Denver Public Schools and its efforts around improvement and reform and all of those things. When you see charter schools, innovation schools, zones, district schools, all of those things. And then finally, we have the crux of a lot of policy. You know, when we think about enrollment policy, for example, it hits the far Northeast hard. And there's like a lot of little things that maybe people don't know. So for example, up until a couple of years ago, a lot of the charter schools didn't have to take students who enrolled after January or who were, older than in their 10th grade year. And all of the students who were later perhaps needed some additional support went to 3 particular schools and they didn't get that additional support. And then they were said, compete, and it's like, if you're not blue, then it means you're not great. But schools had completely different contexts that no one was trying to support them with. And your principal, along with others, really had to contend with that for 10 years, right? And so one of the things that, I'll be unapologetic about is being hard on district leadership about that. And I think my colleagues know what I'm talking about. But it's really to say the far Northeast actually has itself set up a little bit more to actually be more of a collective and be cooperative with each other than other areas of town. And that means, though, all the schools across the family of schools, including charter and innovation schools, should probably be talking to each other more, to share best practices and to lean on each other. I will say the school leaders out here know each other and they talk to each other, but they've done that on their own, which means the system, right, DPS, has not supported them with the structure and the management and the leadership to provide them the space in which they can be most supportive of each other and most creative. And so this has been a very big issue in the district. We have to take on these ideologies head on. That means we have to talk about school choice. We have to talk about enrollment. We have to talk about school funding. We have to talk about principal management. And a lot of the principals who got behind the principal union came out of Northeast Denver because of these issues. And that's honestly going to be the real test of our superintendent and our next superintendent. And so I hope my colleagues know that I entirely intend to enter. This is what's going on in the far Northeast as a question for a superintendent candidate to demonstrate leadership around, because it's been a real gap, right? And so at the end of the day, we put a lot on the shoulders of individuals, and that doesn't have to be their role. That's what it means to be a system. It means to pool resources and ideas. And we need to do better than that. And so I would say that in the last couple of years, I think my colleagues, and please forgive me if I speak out of turn, we begin to uncover these things, because it's not just surface level things that we need to do. We need to talk about who's in roles. We need to talk about who they're managing. We need to talk about our policies. And I think a lot of that has surfaced. And I speak in this vein of saying that I love my colleagues because they're incredibly supportive of the far Northeast. They're here today to hear from you, to know what it is that we need to change. And that it's going to be a real test of ours to get this right.
I would add and concur that I speak with leaders in the far Northeast very often. A lot of them will either pick up the phone and give me a call, or they'll send me a text and they'll tell me that I need to drop what I'm doing and give them a call. And I've had that happen even with your amazing school principal. I love all of our principals equally, but if I did have a favorite, Kimberly Grayson would definitely be in my top 2 of principals, because she's authentic and she's real, and she's doing the work to disrupt injustice in the Denver public schools unapologetically, and doesn't, I've never seen a leader that is willing to say, this could be my last day on the job because I'm going to speak out about this injustice, as much as I do see Principal Grayson do that for her community. And I will say one thing that we have to do better is building some sort of communication line with our Denver Public Schools, principals and our school board, without stepping on the toes of management, because I don't want folks to look at us and think that we are in control of our school leaders, when that is not the case. That it is our superintendent who is in control of the leadership. And that's kind of goes back to one of the first questions about what does the school board do? We are policy, not management. And so as we, go through both of those lens, I believe that this, and if I speak out of turn, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe this board is dedicated to figuring out all solutions on how we can streamline communication, because we all get those emails. We sit down with our superintendent and we say, yo, we got this email, we got a phone call, we got this, we got that. Let's talk, let's be a better advocate, because we also know that some school leaders may trust going to an ally that sits on the school board than they do going to the person that employs them. And so that is something that we have been working on, and I've been working on, to build a safe space to ensure that principals can come to me. We can have those real authentic conversations. And then I'm also excited for, the new leaders that will emerge out of the Far Northeast. We have the Robert F. Smith Academy STEAM School that's coming. We have the Montbello High School reopening. We have the Montbello Middle School that's going to reopen. So we're going to welcome some new leaders to the Far Northeast. And it's going to be our duty to make sure that they have their voices being not just listened to, but actually taking action when they're bringing concerns to us.
Building off of Tay's response there, I think a couple of other pieces. I mean, being a building leader is hard, right? It is hard work. And some of the things you mentioned that have been in the part of the last few years are some of these external forces, that things happening in community life around us that then make what was already a hard job even harder. Now, as a Board of Education, we can't change all of those things. So I think one of our constant questions has to be, what can we change that is within our system to remove some of the difficulty so that the energy can go to the things we can't control? And that's where things like that ombuds office is going to be so important, creating space for real change to happen through conversation so that folks have a place that isn't based on a single relationship. It's based on something that's there no matter who else is around, is really important. The collective voice of that DSLA, that principal union, for lack of a shorter phrase. I mean, collective voice is important. Giving people the chance to be together and work together, I think, will help all of us, because it isn't just about making sure a specific leader has a place to get help when they need it. That's key. This is about every single one of our leaders knowing they are supported and there are things in place to help them continue their work. Because I think some of the other conversation we are going to have soon here is about retention, about keeping our folks here. This is, how do we keep them from being burned out? Because this is critical. That then students like yourselves look to these building leaders and say, look at this, they're supported, they're cared for. This is something I would do. Because if we don't take care of them, you're going to see it. Everyone's going to see it. And who wants to, you know what I want to do? I wanted to go into the job like that person who's frustrated, burned out, and unsupported. Nobody says they want that job. So if we're not doing it for the folks we have now, we're not going to get the folks who are going to do it later. So that's why it feeds into these other conversations so critically for me.
So the Bailey report speaks about the recruitment, retention, and support of Black leaders. This current workload could burn leaders out, specifically in the Far Northeast. We have many leaders of many races in the Far Northeast that are committed to the equity work for all students of color. How is the board working to truly support and retain leaders in the Far Northeast right now?
I would just add to that quickly. We need to be specific in what it is that we want to see, and then name the outcomes we want to see. You know, what does that mean in numbers? What does that mean how people feel? What does it mean on, people being able to refer people to us? There are some really great things we can do to retain people. And the first step is to actually ask people about their experiences, right? So that we can hold ourselves accountable to that. So again, the role of the board, who isn't anyone's particular manager, we can say as a district, we want to see 95%, right, of people retained. We want to see 100% of people say they want to work here. Those are the things that we can do. And then our job is going to be to regularly check. So that means every month, what's the report look like, just as an example. So our role is to set the vision and then hold our teams accountable to doing that. And we can hear from the people who are in the spaces what it is that they need and tie those words into those the checkpoints, right? And those things that we want to hold people accountable to.
I think one of the biggest things that we have been working on is trying to really listen to what our school leaders need so that we address that burnout that folks have been talking about. So that we don't have principals and school leaders and educators saying, well, why does East or why does Northfield have X, Y, or Z? So trying to figure that out has been key and crucial. And that's why I've done over 115 school visits pre-pandemic. And I spent most of my time starting in the far Northeast and listening to the needs of our educators and of our school leaders. And most of the things they were asking for were common. And some folks were like, we need more restorative justice supports. We need more mental health supports. We need this, we need that. Because it would take a load off of the school leaders' back end. And school leaders are talking about how the summer of violence that we had really impacted their school communities. And I know you all had a different environment at your school with you having to go to clear backpacks and doing different entry and exit ways and how that impacted you all. And that wasn't just stressful on you all. It was physically stressful on your school leader because she felt like she didn't have any support outside of the walls of the Dr. Martin Luther King Early College. And so we have to do more work as a district to ensure that school leaders have, a direct pipeline to the Board of Education without repercussion, but without treading the line of, does this go against our principles and does this go against management versus policy, right? And how we can be an advocate for our school leaders while also maintaining and respecting the role and of our superintendent to also be involved in those conversations as well.
I think one other thing I'd just like to highlight that I think we all do well as a board is we're in schools or we're in touch with teachers. Everybody here and Director O'Brien and Director Kobian, who couldn't be here, like we're in touch with teachers. So we hear from teachers. I just did a Zoom call last night with 6 of my friends and I got an earful on what they're thinking about the current state of things, but all of us are in touch and that's how we can support. We also, when there's something that comes up in the far Northeast, Director Anderson and Vice President Bacon are the first 2 people we go to. We listen to the people who have the connections and who represent that community as well.
Thank you for all of your responses. And just to continue the conversation, I'd like to shift gears a little bit and talk about the No Justice, No Peace resolution. And just to start off, I'd like to give a huge thank you to the whole Board of Education for all the work that you've done to pass the No Justice, No Peace resolution and just making sure that all students in DPS will be provided their history. Our superintendent search is underway, and to continue this work, it's essential that our next superintendent keeps the No Justice, No Peace resolution and the implementation of it as a major priority. For you all, what are some of the requirements in your search for a new superintendent who will keep the equity work that we have begun at the forefront?
So we're in the beginning stages of working with a search firm and thinking about all of our qualifications and things that we want to see in the next superintendent. But as you notice, you have 5 board members on this call who all are here on a Monday, giving almost 2 hours of our time to talk to you about this. So you know that this is something that's very important to the entire Board of Education. And so rest assured, this will be one of the priorities that we're looking at as we look for our next superintendent. And to that end, to go back to my other comments, other than us just saying it, we're also, remember, doing implicit bias training through the Denver Public Schools and the equity experience. Vice President Bacon and I have also looked at firms that will come in and do some anti-racist bias training before we begin interviewing superintendents, so that we're not just saying this, we're also ensuring that as we go through and looking for the superintendent, we're keeping this at the forefront of what we're doing.
Well, yeah, so one of the pieces we've done as a board is to take and craft a narrative that speaks to where we are as a district, like where have we been? How do we get here? What's happening right here? And those things are really key and critical. My piece was going to hop in, and I see both you'd mentioned it, Dr. Olson mentioned it, and I think Director Baldermann mentioned it too. But the community engagement piece is a key thing. Our hosts here today, you will have a chance to ask candidates this exact question, not just having to ask us it as well. We expect to create space for these candidates to be engaged by the community. And I think that's one of the commitments we can make to you, is that there will be places and ways for you to ask, and students to ask, and neighborhoods to ask, and community groups to ask these key questions, so that it isn't just, yeah, well, we'll make sure it's there. It's we all will do that together.
I would like to thank each of you guys so much for coming on here and talking to us. We really appreciate everything you've done and are continuing to do to support the implementation and sustainability of our resolution. So once again, thank you.
Thank you. I wore my...
Yes, thank you. Thank all of you.
Appreciate you.
Thank you, guys.
All right. On today's episode, we had an amazing discussion with some members of the Board of Education who signed and helped us pass our No Justice, No Peace resolution on October 22nd, 2020. They've continually supported us in the work we are doing, and they've committed to ongoing contributions toward the implementation and progression of our resolution. They are co-conspirators in this fight for a more equitable future for Denver Public Schools. All students should have equal access to a high-quality education. As long as race, class, and ethnicity continue to be strong predictors of student achievement, college success, and successful life experiences, school board members must work within their school systems to identify barriers and obstacles to opportunity, interrupt their negative impact, and eliminate persistent disparities in student outcomes. When we look at racial achievement data in our nation, we see disparities in education, especially with Black, Latino, Indigenous, and students of color. Here's our call to action. We must never make excuses for any disparities in our school or lower our expectations for any students. Make sure you are doing everything to educate all of the students who attend your schools, all of the students in your community, and implement improvements to address any racial disparities. Make sure you have board members that will focus their work on racial equity in schools and identify all forms of racial equity for 2 reasons. 1, to increase awareness of systemic barriers that disadvantage students of color, and 2, to encourage and support educators as they seek to adapt instructional leadership practices to respond more effectively to the needs and aspirations of all the children they serve. As we've stated multiple times before, our school board has supported us in the creation and implementation of our resolution. And while this is just a start, it's a huge step in the right direction. Now, the next step is to dismantle the policies that support the opportunity gap in education and hire a superintendent who will continue to develop goals and policies with a strong equity lens. For this episode today, we have a specific ask for you. This ask being, can you commit to not only post but promote weekly on each of your social media outlets for the next 6 months about BH365 and our resolution, because we want other school districts across the nation to create a resolution and adopt this curriculum as well.
Yes, let's sit down and collaborate a schedule like what that looks like.
And I also have to ask for you, Miss Bacon. Wington Simpson, when you transition into your new position in the Colorado House of Representatives, District 7, can we count on you to continue to support the resolution by discussing it in your meetings so that we can eventually transition to a statewide policy?
Absolutely, and I can't wait for you all to come down to the Capitol because they really need to see your faces. Tell them what's true, too.
And we have one last ask for Dr. Olson, Mr. Baldermann, and Mr. Laurvick. We have a specific ask for you. Could you please push for a full curriculum adoption of the BH 365 curriculum in our district?
Yes, of course.
Yes, and I want to help Tay with TikTok.
And Tay's in charge of all of our social media, so he'll put it out on all of our Facebook pages. That was a smart ask to ask of him because he does our social media.
And absolutely, I'll support a curriculum like this. And I'd even like to see us take this a step further as a board and look into how we make this, how we start incorporate a culturally responsive curriculum to our policy. So it'll show up in board docs and it'll outlast this board for forever.
That sounds terrific. Thank you, guys.
Make sure you give us your feedback through our social media and contact us for a chance to be on the show and give us your take.